Okay, I think I'm going to try to get started since it looks like it's 10 past. So my name is Eric Höweler. I'm an assistant professor here at the GSD, and I'm currently on leave, so I've been keeping my head down. But I have been working for the GSD. I was just in Chicago organizing a conference called Adaptive Architectures and Smart Materials. And as a result of that, the dean asked me to share some of that information with you because it was a fantastic event in Chicago, and we try to sort of bring some of that back here. The other thing I should say is that I teach studio at the GSD, second year typically. I also teach construction systems class, which some of you were in my class. So a lot of the things that sort of informed the conference in Chicago and some of the things I'm going to show today were sort of developed in that class. And in a way, even though it's an introductory class, some of those ideas sort of evolved from that. So I should also say, a couple years ago, I got a grant from the Dean's Office for junior faculty research, and I researched the future and history of glass, and some of that also kind of informed this. So the talk is, technologies for design, and it's the first, I'm going to talk, is that all right? I'm going to talk a little bit about Merck and GSD, and what happened was a couple years ago, I was contacted by Merck, the German pharmaceutical, chemical, and life sciences company, to do some design research. And they said, well, we've got these interesting products. We're thinking about how to translate liquid crystals and display technologies from the device world into the architectural world. And that was a pretty interesting challenge. And we helped them sort of visualize what the impact of this could be at an architectural and urban scale. They liked that, and then they thought, how do we sort of engage with the broader architectural community? And so they proposed this kind of Merck GSD technologies for building initiative. So Merck is actually giving money to the GSD for an initiative to talk about building materials and how that could impact architecture and urbanism. So at first, you think about Merck, you think about pharmaceuticals, chemicals, and you think, what do those guys know about architecture, and how might that research apply to what we do? Because they just seem like two worlds apart. And thinking about that and trying to figure out how to bridge this world, it occurred to me that we think about materials for architecture. We think about mud, and we think about stone, we think about tools and wood, how we can sort of push the limits of materials in architecture. And Merck comes at it from a different point of view. They look at the architecture of materials. They look at the kind of chemical level, the kind of molecular level of materials. And what they've been looking at is performance materials, smart materials, liquid crystals. And the fact is that pretty much everybody has some Merck in their pocket. They supply liquid crystals for all of your display devices. So all your smartphones, all your TVs, all your computers have Merck inside of them. And this technology, which allows glass to become display, is what they're interested in looking at, how that can inform architecture, so how that technology could impact architecture. And some of the research we did was looking at some of these technologies. Glass already has so many dynamic qualities, but with this liquid crystal, glass becomes all of a sudden variable in its optics. It can go from almost opaque to almost transparent. And looking at that as a product and thinking about how could we use that to sort of unlock the possibilities for architecture was sort of what we were tasked with doing. Hi. First we sort of looked at the material and what could liquid crystal do. These are some of the sort of display samples that you could sort of use it as a touch sensor. You could use it as a kind of as an interface. You could think about how it would change over time. And if you scale that up to the scale of a facade, the possibilities are pretty exciting. But before we did that, we sort of said, wait a minute, what is glass at the sort of basic level? And it's a container, it's an instrument, an optical instrument, it's an environment, it's an atmosphere, it's an interface or an accessory, it's architecture or a brand or a fetish. But we sort of reminded Merck that architecture has been sort of part of architecture for a long time. Architecture has always sort of enlisted architectural materials for atmospheric effects. And if you think about a Gothic cathedral and the role of glass in that, it's an architecture of persuasion. It's an architecture that is a special effects machine. And so it's no surprise that if you look at the history of modern architecture, the use of glass was used to sort of evoke a kind of utopian vision, colored glass associated with spirituality, associated with transparency, democracy, and so on, was part of the kind of imagery of the modern movement. And in 1926, Mies was sort of visualizing a kind of future architecture 30 years before it was technically possible, so it was highly speculative. Mies also imagined these interfaces between inside and outside, between man and nature, as this kind of almost nothingness, this kind of surface and interface. And I like to say that building technologies and materials produce side effects, they produce cultures, and the window produces the culture of seeing. And the culture of seeing has sort of ripples throughout popular culture. So the scene from Rear Window where he's looking through his window at his neighbor unwittingly becomes a witness to a murder. So the culture of seeing is somehow tied to the question of the window and to the building technology. At the same time, it sort of produces cultures of consumption, window shopping, the kind of urban window, the kind of urban life that's seen through the window. So the kind of banal everyday object, the kind of product that we might specify, all of a sudden I try to sort of expand it and think about it as a kind of cultural artifact that produces modern life, that produces urban life. So digging a little bit, and some people that were in my class will see some of these and remember them because they're sort of familiar. I'm always struck by these birds on the Neue Nationalgalerie because Mies wants them to go away. He wants everything to go away. Yet the bird still sort of persists. It still sort of marks that surface and sort of, in a way, undoes the kind of nothingness that Mies sort of sought. And the other presence in the Neue Nationalgalerie is the question of condensation. And so even though it wants to go away, even though Mies would like it to be nothing, it's still something, and it's still an atmosphere apart, and it's subject to the rules of dew point and condensation and so on. So the kind of the condensation sort of drizzling down the face of the Neue Nationalgalerie sort of insists on the kind of material presence of the envelope, this kind of stubborn presence, and reminds us of its role actually as an atmosphere. The role of glass in contemporary architecture, we do see practices organized around issues of viewing, framing, sort of controlling the reception of nature, the reception of place or site, and architecture persists in using glass as a kind of as a material for framing views of landscape, for example. And the presence of the glass is not, I think, completely acknowledged. But if we think about questions of energy, as we do at the GSD, and questions of local energy effects, like the urban heat island effect, we understand that glass and energy are somehow at odds. If we look at cities like Phoenix, the use of glass in this context seems sort of counterintuitive. And if we look at the kind of explosion of construction in certain contexts, we have to wonder if glass is an appropriate material in these places. So the kind of architectural dream, the kind of mythology of glass, the kind of economics of glass, sort of running up against the kind of fact that how can a glass building be considered green? Won Bryant Park, won all kinds of awards. It's LEED Platinum or something, but it's still an all-glass building, which from a kind of solar heat gain point of view, you might wonder, well, how could that be? It doesn't seem to make sense. Won Bryant Park, looking closely at the facade, we see the kind of frit pattern that masks the spandrel, that tries to sort of blur the line between vision and spandrel glass, and sort of mediate the impact of this sort of heat gain condition. So think about Merck and what they have as a product, and the role of architecture as this kind of interface between inside, outside, between individuals, users, occupants, and their environments. I sort of went back and I looked a little bit at, what is the window really? And this is an image of a TV in a window, and people watching TV through the window. And if you look at ads for TVs, you often think of the TV as a window, and so it thought it was interesting that Merck is coming and saying, we've got this TV technology that we want to put in your window. Could we turn your window into a display device with the same technology? So that seems super exciting to speculate about how that would transform facades from simply envelopes into sort of communicating surfaces, heat regulating surfaces, all kinds of exciting ideas. So looking at their technology, they're looking at liquid crystal technology. It has benefits in terms of speed and switching range, dimming, all kinds of good stuff. But I think beyond a kind of technical description, I think the consequence would be more at the scale of architecture as sort of urban face, as a kind of facade. What happens to the facade of architecture once it's all glazed, once it becomes a kind of communicating surface. And looking again at the kind of the moments within architecture that glass is utilized for these functions. These are the images of the Farnsworth house that we like to look at. This is an image of the Farnsworth house that sort of when nobody was looking. The blinds are drawn for privacy, probably for heat gain. This other image with the kind of roll down shades, this sort of undoes the kind of the aspirational image of what this building wants to be. And you don't have to look far. The Flatiron building, at a certain moment was covered with awnings. This is solar control in a very basic, very straightforward way. So some of these things we've sort of forgotten about when we design buildings. Solar control is such a kind of necessary condition. Korb also found out the hard way with his Salvation Army building. On the left, the original taut neutralizing skin, hermetically sealed. On the right, retrofitted with brise-soleil to sort of control the impact of the sun on that west-facing facade. And so what are the sort of tools that architects use to control heat gain? So Foster's Willis Faber Dumas building in Ipswich, one of the first sort of all-glass patch-fitting buildings, uses tinted glass, right? So this building at nighttime looks awesome. In the daytime, it looks so dark. It looks solid and impenetrable. So tinting glass is one mechanism for controlling heat gain. And I always love this slide from an old curtain wall ad where the kind of tinting and the reflectivity is something that's sort of being played with in the sort of glasses of the police officer. So strong, reliable, good under pressure. Other tools, reflectivity. Architects have used reflectivity sometimes in a kind of banal way to create sort of generic stuff, and in some cases, like this Barco-Leibinger building, a highly speculative way, sort of turning the building into a kind of kaleidoscopic sort of special effects machine. Other examples of reflectivity have used it, I think, in different ways to create different architectural effects. So, and then architectural side effects, right? The walkie-talkie building that famously melted the car, that's reflectivity sort of gone awry. Other strategies, for an all-glass building like the Seattle Public Library, you should know that as an all-glass building, it's gaining lots of heat, even in Seattle, and so the architects understood the structure as a kind of shading device, but also embedded within the glass is a kind of micro mesh that does regulate heat gain on the faces that actually see the sun. So there's a permanent, adapted way to regulate heat on this building. All the faces that see the sun have the micro mesh to control that heat gain question. And because it's my lecture, I can slip this in. This is a little project that we did that makes place through controlling sun. Shade in Phoenix is the way to make place. So we designed a kind of sun shading structure. It actually harvests some energy from the sun and also sort of plays that back in the nighttime. So shading, fixed shading, sort of specifically selective of points of view of sun angles to create place in Phoenix. One of my favorite examples, Jean Nouvel's Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris, famously deployed a aperture, a sort of kinetic aperture, which had many effects. I think it created an incredible sort of pattern on the facade. When it worked, it actually regulated the light sort of coming in and out. and produced these kind of incredible shadows in the interior that sort of recalled the kind of Islamic pattern-making traditions of the architecture he was referring to. So operating on many levels. And other strategies, like Sejima's Toledo Art Pavilion, Toledo Art and Glass Pavilion, use kind of layered glass. So we understand glass not as nothingness, but actually something that's layered and aggregated. And actually, interestingly, the cavity, would typically be a 1-inch sort of sandwich of glass with an insulated glass unit, is now a 2-foot or 3-foot cavity that's actually inhabitable. So sort of taking that cavity zone, that sort of thermal buffer, and sort of spatializing it at the scale of architecture. So interesting device, and produces social effects, people in the cavity, and people interacting through the glass. And one of my favorite descriptions is there's so much glass that at a certain point it becomes a kind of presence, it becomes a kind of a solidity. And Florian pointed out there's like 26 layers of glass through one. You could draw a line through and cut through 26 layers of glass. All this to get at the question of what is the window for architecture, what are its techniques and devices, and how might we sort of start to think about what that could be in the future, from the inside out, from the outside in. One of the things that any real estate brochure will sell the view, and I think this is One Bryant Park, and so that was the question of like, how do you sell that view, but also think about how you could start to manage that in a simple way, without the kind of presence of physical blinds and so on. So that the idea of screening or manipulating the optical properties of glass simply electronically seems very appealing. And so some of the work that we delivered to Merck at the time was thinking about, well, what are the conclusions for them coming at architecture from the outside in a way? And we said, well, energy will move to the foreground of design, and all surfaces will become opportunities for generating energy. We also said that architecture will integrate display technologies in all of its surfaces. Urban spaces will communicate with audiences, creating new communication channels. User-produced content will start to occupy some of this new sort of media landscape. Sensors will transform spaces into responsive environments, responsive to inhabitants, but also to environments. And the Internet of Things, which I think this falls under the category of, will eventually recede from the foreground to the background, and these things will sort of disappear. But I do think one of the things I was telling Merck is the future building envelopes will become smart interfaces, responsive environments, responsive to inhabitants, becoming adaptive, communicative, and integrated. So that was a kind of pitch to Merck, so why architecture would be important to them. They agreed to give us some money, and then we said we're going to host a conference. We're going to call it Adaptive Architectures and Smart Materials. And we chose to do this in Chicago, coinciding with the inaugural Chicago Architecture Biennale. I even put on a white shirt for the event. But I invited Liz Diller to come and give the keynote. And for me, Liz was someone who understood, I think, that building technology is never just a technology, it's always a kind of cultural artifact. And I mentioned the Slow House in my introduction, because the Slow House, even though it was unbuilt, was always about the windshield of the car and the panoramic view. And the house, the space of residing or living was somehow sandwiched between those two sort of visual moments. And as you know, as you may know, as I hope you know, where's the mouse? That view, which is a kind of panoramic view, is actually displayed inside the house on a TV screen. And the TV screen sort of plays back footage of that same view from a different time or a different season. So it's never just an unmediated view, it's always a view that's somehow mediated by media, And so way back in 1994, when I first saw Liz speak, I was really impressed with this idea that she was looking at architecture not just as material, but also as media. But she was thinking about how architecture functioned sort of culturally, and how an architect might practice in that space using technology, using media technology, but also building technology to advance certain arguments about how we use architecture to normalize certain conditions, how we use it to frame nature, how we use it to sort of position ourselves relative to the natural and the man-made. So that's why I asked Liz to come. She came, and she actually gave a great talk. She showed a lot of the recently opened Broad, where the Broad uses a kind of thick skin to manage light, and this is, I think, a new territory for Höweler, sort of into a kind of very precise kind of formal language, but ultimately it's still about that kind of experiential atmosphere within. So highly technical sort of description of panels and geometries, resulting in this kind of breathtaking interior, which is really a kind of architectural effect. So back to the question of architecture of persuasion, to the Gothic cathedral, and to the role of architecture and building technologies as productive of these effects. So she showed this in Chicago. She also showed this, which I wasn't so familiar with, which is a project she did at the Fondation Cartier in Paris, where they installed a kind of smart bucket that would go around the gallery. And I don't have her video, which was very cute, but it would go around the gallery, and it would park, and then a drop of water would land in the bucket, and then the bucket would roll around to another part of the gallery, and then another drop of water would land. So this was a kind of clever installation that they did in a Jean Nouvel building, which is famously all glass, which apparently leaks, and apparently Jean Nouvel was not pleased. But the sort of innocence of the bucket and the kind of playfulness of it, I think it sort of pointed out something about architecture and envelopes, and issues of leaking. In the conversation with Liz, Moisen and Liz sort of discussed lots of things. Moisen brought up the buckets that we have here at the GSD. These buckets is sort of still sort of stupid buckets. They still point out the fact that architecture does leak. So questions of leakage and envelopes were the subject of discussion there. But I want to talk about the conference itself and some of that content. I organized it into 4 panels: Histories, Materials, Technologies, and Ecologies. And that was a simple way to sort of bring all these people together and have them sort of perform a kind of series of discussions and series of presentations that would have a certain arc. So in the first panel, I invited Terry Riley, Todd Gannon, Yves Blau, Aaron Betsky, and Blaine Brownell. And I agreed to moderate them. And I invited them partially because I think this whole discussion of materials and architecture and surfaces was something that I remember from 1994 when I moved to New York, and light construction was the show everyone was talking about. And it had just replaced the show that everyone had been talking about, which was deconstructivist architecture, 1988. So between 1988 and 1994, the MoMA had shifted from a kind of interest in French philosophy and sort of complex form to Terry Riley's light construction, which seemed to indicate a shift away from form and towards surface, and towards, in a way, the materials of architecture. And I thought that was really interesting at that time. At the same time, Bernard Tschumi was sort of promoting the paperless studio, the immaterial of architecture, the kind of the digital studio, while the GSD was still sort of talking about materials and poetics and construction. And so there was an opposition set up in the 90s between the kind of Columbia School of advanced form and computational design, and the GSDs sort of were still about material. And not that long afterwards, the GSD had an exhibition called Immaterial Ultramaterial that Toshiko Mori curated here in the gallery. And that was a kind of reaffirmation that the GSD is still interested in physical effects. In 1997, Material Connection opened. The GSD acquired all this material in the materials library. So this was a moment where it was sort of up for grabs. Was the GSD going to go digital? Were they going to stick with the kind of material culture that they'd had? So I thought Terry had sort of launched this whole thing in 1994, so I invited him to come and present. And I thought, 20 years, let's have some look back. Let's think about what are the consequences. And he talked about Jean Nouvel's Fondation Cartier. He talked about Toyo Ito's Tower of Winds. He talked a lot about Mies. And, was Mies really believing that the glass wasn't there? And he actually found this drawing where Mies actually renders the glass as a physical presence. So in his mind, he's like, yes, Mies understood actually that the optical effects of glass, he wasn't simply ignoring, he was actually very conscious of that. So Terry presented a kind of recap of light construction. Todd Gannon came along, and he had published the Light Construction Reader a couple years after, sort of affirming the fact that light construction wasn't simply theory light. It actually had a kind of incredible scholarship that went with it. And Todd sort of brought in high tech, and he said we should talk about high tech, not because that was around the same time. And he was sort of bringing up Rainer Banham and some of Rainer Banham's interests in the high-tech movement. So Todd sort of brings in high-tech architecture, Cedric Price, Archigram, and this other question of envelope. How minimal can the envelope be? And then Eve Blau came, and some of you may be in her class, but she blew my mind with a presentation that looked at the Bauhaus. It looked at Mies, and she was saying, typically the Bauhaus is understood as glass, as just this immaterial thing, it's a kind of industrial thing, but she was actually looking at Moholy-Nagy and some of his sort of photographic techniques and how he really celebrated, reflectivities, different optical effects. So I think Eve sort of took, Terry's light construction and sort of gave us a lot more sort of historical context for both Bauhaus, Dessau, and Tugendhat House, Mies, but also Sejima. And Eve has been looking at Sejima very closely in contemporary architecture. So I think she was able to sort of take Terry's stuff and sort of bring it right into the present. And the last speaker in the first panel was Blaine Brownell, who is prolifically sort of publishing books on materials, and he showed some quite provocative new materials, sort of doing, communicating. So from the left, traditional communicating architectures, to the right, high-tech facades. He's a big champion of new materials. He writes a monthly column in Architect magazine. He was really looking at the future of these potential materials. I should also say I skipped over Aaron Betsky, who came along and sort of, kicked things open a bit and said we don't need high-tech architecture, we actually need low-tech architecture. And he sort of disrupted a little bit the kind of panel by saying, you guys are all, crazy, looking at all this high-tech stuff, and really we need no architecture. So that was a little bit of a recap of that discussion. But for me, I was interested to know, if these things are technique-based, and I think Eve made a great case that, Moholy-Nagy and Mies were actually using very particular techniques. I was asking, well, how do we teach that? How do we teach those things in school? What's the kind of pedagogical function of materials? Where materials seem so tied to construction that if we're in an academic context, how do we actually look at those very carefully? And a couple of days ago, I met with a student who's doing a thesis on material effects using simulations. And I said, well, what about real material prototypes? Shouldn't we be teaching that? And we have a great materials library here. So for me, it raised lots of questions about, at the GSD, how should we teach these techniques? The next panel was called Materials. And Kiel was nice enough to agree to moderate. We invited Jan Nippers from Stuttgart, Skylar Tibbetts from MIT, Gail Peter Borden from USC, and Sheila Kennedy from MIT. And these guys were starting to look not just at the kind of theories of materials, but actually how could these become highly speculative. And Jan showed some pretty interesting work he'd done on plastics. He's written several books on polymers. And he showed this project that he worked on in South Korea, looking at simple sort of actuated facades and how they might work to create this sort of literal kinetic facade. And so this is a pavilion built in South Korea that Jan advised on, where the kind of pressure on the plastic panel actually allows it to sort of cup and actuate. Pretty impressive stuff. And Jan is also teaching at the Technical University in Stuttgart and has a practice, Nippers-Helbig, structural engineer, advanced engineering. So that was interesting to see how polymers might have their own logic. Sheila Kennedy, who has a firm called MatX, Materials X, showed a number of projects. One of them just down the street here, the Tanner Anthropology Building, where they sort of speculated a little bit about, bricks. There was plenty of Kahn references. What does a brick want to be? What does it not want to be? Why are we still talking about the brick? But Sheila showed this project with some others, looking at sort of logics of aggregation, logics of assembly. And she's one of these people that's so incredibly thoughtful about the most banal things like drywall and bricks. Skylar showed some of the work he's doing at MIT. He's got a lab called the Self-Assembly Lab. I'm sure you know him. He's talking about 4D printing. How do we print with embedded magnets and things that will allow things to sort of curl up and self-assemble. He's 3D printing materials that have a degree of control in them, so he can sort of manipulate them after the fact. He sort of famously talks about, architecture material and architectural labor. And if materials are self-assembling, how can we remove the question of labor from that equation, which is pretty provocative. And he showed this cute video, which I love. Basically, if we take a frame, like a space frame, and we assemble it on the ground, there's all this incredible labor of lifting and arranging and fitting. And his argument goes like, well, why don't we sort of use the space above the construction site as a space and actually allow materials to, in a way, self-assemble by providing them with, I guess, sympathetic faces to match. And I think this probably took some time, but it's still pretty compelling stuff, So, after 8 hours you get a cube, 16 hours you get a beam, at a certain point you get a lattice, and I love the soundtrack, it's like easy. And so it lands, and then you've got the space frame assembled. So, pretty compelling stuff. They had an incredible discussion about, you try to put these people together, Keel and Skylar and Sheila. Sheila's like, well, there's no silver bullet. There's no magic material that's going to sort of transform architecture. It still requires kind of intelligence. Smartness isn't in the material, it's actually in the design. So that was a pretty great discussion. The next panel, technologies, Mariana agreed to sort of moderate this group, and thinking about not just the materials themselves, but actually their systems and components, how they sort of aggregate into more complex systems. Chuck Hoverman, who teaches here, famously sort of working on all kinds of kinetic ideas. Hanif Kara, who also teaches here, structural engineer, working on so many sort of complex and interesting projects. Dennis Sheldon, who teaches at MIT. Gary Technologies, and Mark Simmons, who I think we're trying to get to teach here from front, envelope consultant. And so this panel sort of, I think, got into more sort of complex issues of architecture. Mark basically said, look, my job is hard enough. I have to deal with all these things, and that's just a facade. And so he was sort of skeptical of the idea that adaptive or kinetic would be really the future of architecture. He was saying, look, I have a hard time getting an operable window to not leak. This is from like the premier facade consultant in the world. So I think he was sort of putting the brakes on some of the sort of enthusiasm for the word adaptive, and I think rightly so. Then he went on to show like about 100 projects that he's consulted on. Some of them with great big moving parts, and some of them with moving lights, and But he went on to say, look, this is my world. I sort of work in this sort of highly complex thing, and if you guys don't bet on adaptability, think about there's always complexity and managing complexity. But he was sort of cautioning against this sort of uncritical embrace of adaptability, which was interesting because then Chuck Hoberman came along, and his whole thing is kinetics, right? He's like, well, I've built my whole career around making these things move in dynamic ways and wonderful ways. And Chuck showed all kinds of projects he's done, structural kinetics, deploying structures. I found the most interesting ones were the ones where he's working on envelopes. He's formed a joint venture with Bureau Happold. They're looking at how layered facades have different ways of regulating heat gain, again, by moving material in space with these very small movements, creating, quite beautiful, actually, and simple, unlike the Jean Nouvel project, facades. And he also showed like these very large stadium roofs that he's working on. And then Dennis Sheldon came along and said, you guys forget it. I'm actually interested in information. And actually information is what drives all this sort of complexity. He's one of the founders of Gary Technologies. And he showed, any building, whether it's a kind of Louis Vuitton building that Aaron Betsky had trashed earlier, all this complexity, all this exuberance, it really comes down to kind of spreadsheets and managing the information, and that's something that architecture should really leverage, our ability to manage these complex systems through our softwares. So he sort of made a case for information as our medium, not material, not form, and sort of irregardless of material and form. But he also made the case for Gary Technologies producing platforms, collaborative platforms, not just software. So that was interesting. Mariana did a great job of curating a discussion about innovation and risk. Whose role is it to innovate at this scale? Is it in building industry? Is it architecture? Is it the academy? And the last group was called Ecologies, just to sort of give it the impression that the conference actually had an arc and a trajectory, and things are getting more and more complex. And at the end, we could talk about complete, sort of synthetic, comprehensive buildings. And so Florian moderated this panel. We had Frank Barco, Jeannie Gang, Martin Henn, Michael Meredith, and Matthias Schuler, all sort of, except for Matthias, all architects, but also people that had sort of pulled it all together. And in a way, it was important to sort of end on something sort of, not just sort of, particles, but trying to end on something at the architectural scale. Frank, who he's always interested in technique. He's interested in, fabrication technique, producing its own vocabulary, materials having effects, and he showed this project that he proposed for these solid, lightweight concrete, sort of load-bearing facade elements that have the kind of heating elements embedded in them, which I think is an awesome sort of way to develop prototypical parts and then speculate about what those could mean at a low-rise or mid-rise or high-rise scale. Jeannie Gang showed a few different projects. One of them that struck out to me was the solar carved tower, which is the kind of inverse of the kind of Hugh Ferris or the kind of New York setback skyscraper, because it sort of flips that around and talks about how is the sun actually moving and how might a kind of strategic sort of carving actually improve its solar performance. So it's not about making the glass more resistant to the sun, it's about making the glass sort of look away when the sun comes. So in a way that has consequences on the form of the building, formal consequences, and I think formal opportunities. Then Matthias Schuler showed some of the work he's been doing with different architects, including Frank Gehry. This is from Novartis in Basel, identifying, within this form, the different territories, the different zones. Some zones you need to control, some zones you don't need to control, and how being selective about or being smart about environmental systems working with the environment, how they could put their energy literally in certain places and not in others. So, and then using PVs and other screening systems strategically positioned to make this building, which seems like an energy sort of train wreck, into something that would actually embody some sort of intelligence. But Matthias Schuler actually ended by saying, we do it for the people. It's actually about, at the end of the day, it's not about this formal exuberance or this kind of technological sort of showcasing. It's really about the way people experience space, whether it's sort of in a curtain wall building or within a park-like setting. This is from the Milan Biennial. And one of the speakers, Martin Henn, is designing the Merck headquarters in Darmstadt, and he showed an innovation center that he's working on where they are sort of deploying a lot of these materials as a kind of showcase. It's actually a pretty cool building. It's got this sort of quadrifoil organizational structure. It's meant to sort of pioneer new working environments. It looks a little bit like the Media Lab at MIT, lots of kind of sectional conditions. But within it, there's also the idea that you could sort of showcase all these different products. You could showcase these different glass products, different lighting products. Merck makes OLEDs. So this becomes a kind of a corporate headquarters, also a kind of showcase building. They had, I think, a sort of great discussion at the end about the role of technology, innovation. Should it happen in the academy? Maybe it's a kind of partnership between the Mercks of the world and the Permis Elises of the world, the kind of, somehow putting it together. But I think ultimately we had a panel of architects, and the question was, should architects be pushing these innovations through their work? Can we broker some of these conditions? And I think the answer hopefully is yes. So that was the kind of super fast summary of the conference. I have to say we did do an exhibition for the conference, which some of the team was here. We built it in Boston. We drove it to Chicago, or Sophia drove it to Chicago, installed it in the space, and it really, I think for the event, there was a conference happening inside. There was material outside. And I think it gave people the opportunity to see some of these materials, not just to see images, but actually to sort of touch some of these things. And I think it sort of, I think it was important to complement the content of the conference with the actual things that you could hold and touch. And there were, I think, moments where the people from Merck were sitting there with architects saying, hey, let's collaborate on something. Let's work, so Sheila Kennedy was like, let's talk about PVs. With the Merck people, and I think there are research opportunities that will come out of this kind of conference as a kind of matchmaking sort of situation. At the end, the Germans were happy with the event and the conference, and so I think what that sets up is the opportunity for the next conference, right? For the next series in this initiative, and I've already started thinking about that, even though we're still recovering from the last one. I do think, this question of display architecture and communicating spaces, I think could be a really interesting new direction to think about, not just thermal performance, but actual, how do we use display technologies to make architecture a broadcast medium? So very quickly, the trailer for the next one was, thinking about architecture as legible, as print, as digital, the transformation of lighting from illumination to communication, the idea that lighting now is becoming a kind of a signal. And how do we think about that in terms of architecture? Venturi early on was saying, architecture is about a kind of billboard, literally, and all of our surfaces become display surfaces, and they display content. They have inputs, they have outputs. What are they communicating? Are they communicating their energy consumption patterns? Are they communicating other kind of content? In a way, it makes all surfaces into interfaces. And what does that mean for architecture? If we're used to sort of looking at a surface of a screen, what happens when we start looking through that surface? A surface to look through, not a surface to look at. And screens are not just about looking at, they're also about touching. How do we use sort of the tactility of architecture to think about what it could be? And then, because I still have a little bit of time, I'm going to show you one or two little projects that we've been working on at the border with Mexico in Fa&ccedil. The federal government is building a new border crossing to improve wait times, where you can wait 6 hours at the border. We were asked to make a proposal here, so we proposed a screen that's 1 pixel high by 600 feet long, and the idea was, while you're waiting, you want to know that something's happening. So we're basically taking the information from the system to broadcast it on the facade on this screen. And so every time a car goes through, there's a burst of light, and that somehow communicates on a very basic level that the border is not just impermeable, it's actually highly permeable, and there's movement sort of happening there all the time. This video is a little funny. But I think, at a time when the kind of rhetoric around borders is going off the charts, the idea that architecture functions at these limits as interfaces, not just to sort of prohibit or allow passage, but actually functions at these moments to communicate something about architecture. So it's not just about don't come in or about saying bienvenido or something cheesy like that. This very modest installation can visualize flow, can communicate in a mode sort of beyond language. It doesn't have to say bienvenido or welcome or anything. But I think it reminds us that architecture has this role at these interfaces and has this role to sort of communicate in different channels, in different ways. One last thing I want to show before I'll ask you for some comments is we just built this project in Roxbury for a new government center. We didn't build a building, we built a sculpture in front of it. The building is by Merck. It's a government building in Boston. The brief was, how do you build something that represents all the neighborhoods in Boston? And so there was an idea that with 21 neighborhoods, we can create this sort of bundled structure that sort of relies on other elements to be kind of self-buttressing. And then the idea is that the sculpture is a map of the city, and it sort of conveys all the 311 data, which is basically how citizens are interacting with the government to sort of improve the city by reporting traffic lights, potholes, trash, whatever. But I think it's a very modest idea. But essentially, citizens are participating in the construction of their cities and the management and operations of their cities in different ways through different devices. And if you see a pothole and you sort of report it, maybe they'll come back and fix it. But what this represented for us is a highly rich sort of data set. It's a data stream that's constantly updating, that has very precise geo-tagging. And so we know exactly where these reports are coming from. And for us, it was an opportunity to take these data sets and use them to sort of create the content for this interactive sculpture. And it's not interactive, just I touch it, it changes color. It's actually somehow broadcasting a kind of larger kind of network of interactions between citizens and the city in a pretty rich way. And so this is a project we built over the summer, fabricating the components into this kind of bundled spire, which had lighting elements within it. And just a quick video of an interaction. So in its normal mode, it's sort of flickering when things are being reported. But there's also an opportunity, and this is something that the city wanted, for a kind of real sort of one-on-one interaction, so that it's not just about these kind of bursts, these kind of seemingly random bursts. They were saying, how do citizens interpret this communication? And how might they understand themselves relative to this bigger sort of dialogue that's going on? So this is a little bit of footage from a test where we're allowing a user with a handheld device to sort of trigger a behavioral pattern in the sculpture in real time. So that's opening this Friday. at Dudley Square, and you're all invited to 5 o'clock to come and see it. Bring your smartphones. I think for me it does represent a mode where we're thinking about architecture a little bit differently. That it's not about envelope systems and mechanical systems. Now these are becoming kind of synthetic. It's not about a 2D surface. It's about a kind of 4D situation where envelopes and building systems are becoming much more interactive, much more communicative, much more adaptable, and really kind of 4D surfaces. So, stay tuned for the next conference. Thank you. Okay, how was that? Is that okay? I try to faithfully represent what happened in Chicago, giving you a little bit of an update, but also, let you know what we're working on and what we're looking forward to, other kind of events or research opportunities to work with industry. I think it's pretty unusual to have an opportunity to work with someone like Merck, who has their own sort of agendas, have their own research funding, but to bring an industrial partner in to a school like the GSD and think about what we could do with someone like that, with a company like that, to do studios, to do workshops, to do material research. So I think that's pretty exciting to sort of think about what they could do for us and how we could help them, because they're desperately looking for design. They just don't know how to do it. So I think that's something we can help them think about, the impact that they would have on the built environment, something that they're not used to. Any thoughts?
I have a thought. I really appreciate you using the plural. I really appreciate you using the plural of technologies. There's this tendency in the media to talk about technology as if it were something, and technologies makes it clear there's many of them. You've obviously identified and inventoried and played with some of them. Are there some that you have imagined or wished for, but we don't have yet?
Well, isn't what's his name? Marty's supposed to show up any day now, any moment now, from Back to the Future, today. So, I mean, I think, architects are about futures. That's our job, is to speculate. We're often asked to think about the future of that, the glass, the future of, this or that. I think that's what we do. That's what we do best, is sort of speculate. And it's not science fiction. It's always about like what is in the present that might sort of create a scenario where a future might be possible. So possible futures, near casting, I think. So I think as architects, we're sort of ideally positioned to do that kind of near casting. I think designers in the school are great at it. I'm not sure, Marty had this like hoverboard thing that he was looking for and that didn't materialize. I think the hoverboard would be pretty cool. We've been sort of going away from kind of pure materials, looking at media as a material. So this next one about communicating, like what if every surface was somehow a display, active, beyond kind of aspect ratios, just but that may not be a future everybody wants, for sure. People would say, well, I don't want all that stuff. But I think it's interesting to speculate about what would happen in those futures with those technologies. Other thoughts? What does this mean for me at the GSD? There's an incredible materials library down there, right? Been down there? Amazing. I feel like the studios being up here and the materials library being down there, it's one of the problems. We don't go down there enough to engage with real things. Maybe we're too enamored with our...
It's also online. It's on the web.
Okay, yeah. Physical.
Some of these projects are really like starting with the material and discovering what the form could be like, starting with the glass, with the Diller-Scofidio building, or with the Geary Novartis building, it's like starting with the form, and then how can we adapt the material to make this a pleasant environment, assuming this form. So are there examples you could cite where there's more of a synthesis between material and form, where they're kind of evolving together to create a design?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think that Gary is a kind of brute force example, right? I want this form, and I will force that glass into that form. And it's actually pretty innovative, the kind of cold forming that Gary sort of did on the IAC building in New York. Basically, he discovered that glass is actually pretty flexible. Within a certain range, you could actually cold form it. And instead of like having 1 million different unique panels, he had like 500,000, because he said half of these I can cold form into this geometry. I think he's still wrestling the material into the form, no doubt. But I think he's still been pretty pioneering and sort of testing the limits of what a material could do. If you didn't begin with form, as you suggest, and you said, well, what could the material do? If I can bend it like half a degree, could I develop a vocabulary out of that half a degree bend? That might be, reverse engineering that. Maybe the building would be much more subtle, because it would have very, very subtle curves and not this kind of, sort of forced forms. I can't think of a project right now that would be more sympathetic to the material, but I'm sure there's a way to do it. I also think the idea that you build out of glass because it's efficient and cheap, and then you build in the desert, so you tint it and coat it and put sunshades on it, that seems very unsympathetic to me. And even if it had a liquid crystal in it, I'm not sure it's still the right place to build. So I guess you have to ask, when not to build, when to build in different ways. Yeah, I don't have the answer, but I do think I'm just asking us to be more conscious of how we use glass and when we use it. What's the fitness of a solution like that? Todd?
Was there I can explain why I'm going to ask the question in a bit. Was there any criticism to gadgetry? It seems like all your examples were, there was a lot of overkill, gadgetry, cheap tricks. And then when I look at, my office is in Norway and Scandinavia, and the way we make our architecture in Scandinavia, it's the opposite way of this is going. It's more simplification and purity in materials. And the way we work actually is we work with industry developing prototypes. We don't draw that many construction details until we work directly with them. But was there any criticism of all this gadgetry, or was it like everyone was preaching to convert it? Or?
Aaron Betsky sort of put up some resistance.
That's a problem for me.
No, he pointed out, look, you guys are all sort of obsessed with the latest sort of technology. Why so high tech? How about low tech? What about no tech? What about no architecture? So he sort of pushed in the complete opposite direction, repurposing buildings, thinking about, things that people could build themselves, So I think he was sort of pushing back, as you are, on this kind of super duper sort of gadgetry. I'm not pushing for high tech. I'm actually just pushing for kind of just being smarter about the technology that we use. I do think glass and architecture will continue to be a kind of material of choice, because the economics and the operations are so attractive. But the question is, how might a speculation at the scale of the particle change that completely? Change the economics, change the performance characteristics, and I think that's, for me, exciting. I still think at a certain moment in Dubai, maybe you just shouldn't do that. You shouldn't use glass at all. Or maybe in Norway. Those are kind of extreme examples where you wouldn't be looking for an all-glass building. You'd be looking for something a lot more insulated. But I think that's what we want to communicate. Is that there's an appropriateness to technology, despite all the kind of innovation. We still have to exercise judgment.
I found it particularly interesting when you talked about almost like the use of light as a communication tool and that relationship to architecture. And I'm just wondering what, maybe you could speak more to what precisely you're trying to communicate and the purpose of these communications. For example, I found it particularly poetic, the last two projects you showed, of how these light installations are almost showing these invisible processes, if I may term it like that. But I'm just wondering, as perhaps a pedestrian watching or looking at these installations, what is the message that I'm trying to understand? Am I trying to understand the actual processes that's happening and the kind of more precise information out of it, or is it just understanding this almost suggestive idea that there is a process happening?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. We've been interested in sort of making architecture more communicative, embedding media in it. And I like to just say, it's always had content. The Gothic cathedral had content, and it was trying to convey and persuade and convert in a way. Your average building, may not have that kind of agenda. But office buildings, you hire an architect to design an office building, it's conveying a certain condition, whether it's like, oh, this is a Frank Gehry building or this is a kind of high-tech thing. Architecture is always communicating through form, and I was just saying maybe we could expand that to be not just about form but actual content. The question you raised, though, is like, at a certain point, there's a kind of superabundance of content. And then there's a kind of breakdown of communication where you're communicating, but no one's receiving or understanding. So I think it's interesting to think about communication theory. There's a kind of broadcast and there's a kind of receiver. There's a kind of signal and then there's noise. And how do we think about architecture in those terms? I don't have the answer, but I do think it's important that we start asking those questions. That the facades are no longer facades; they're actual interfaces, and interfaces have content, they have users, they have. So maybe it's a subtle thing, but I think thinking about architecture in those terms, we can start to develop our own new techniques for talking about architecture differently. Because we talk about occupants, but I think we'll increasingly talk about users. We'll talk about recipients or receivers, not just occupant. So I'm trying to sort of ready, I think, a discipline for a future which I think is almost inevitable, and we don't yet have the tools to work in that medium yet. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.